In the autumn of 1887, in the high country town of Garnet Crossing, Colorado, a young woman stood at the threshold of a building that had not been properly entered in 11 years. The building was narrow and 2 stories, pressed between an assayer's office and a harness shop on the main street, and it had been a bookstore once, or so the oldest residents maintained when pressed. The sign above the door had weathered to illegibility. The windows on the ground floor were shuttered from within. The second-floor glass was clouded with a decade of grime and altitude dust, and one pane had cracked along its diagonal without anyone to replace it. The man who had owned it, a printer and bookseller named Aldous Finn, had died the previous winter in his rooms above the shop, tended at the last only by a neighbor woman who reported that he had refused to leave his bed downstairs, that he had asked her to lock the door when she left, and that he had pressed a key into her palm with the instruction that it go to no one. She had given it, eventually, to the town's county land office, as she could think of no other authority. The land office had held it for 8 months, and when no heir appeared, and the property taxes fell 3 years into arrears, the building had been put to auction on a Thursday morning in October, with a minimum bid of $6. Nora Clem had paid $7. She was 26 years old, the daughter of a typesetter who had taught her his trade before his lungs gave out in the mining camps south of Leadville, and she had come to Garnet Crossing 6 weeks earlier with $41, a compositor's stick, and a leather-wrapped bundle of her father's tools. She had been looking for a place to set up a small printing concern, the kind that handled land notices and weekly handbills, and the occasional church circular. She had not been looking for a bookstore, sealed and suspect, with a dead man's history woven into its planking. But she had stood at the back of the auction crowd and watched the auctioneer describe the property in terms of what it lacked, and she had done arithmetic in her head, and she had bid. The auctioneer had looked at her with the particular expression men reserve for women who purchase things they could not possibly manage. The 2 other bidders, both of them merchants from the lower end of town, had not bothered to counter. One of them said something to his companion that Nora did not quite hear, but that produced a short laugh, and she understood that this was the shape of her reception in Garnet Crossing. If you have ever held something in your hands that everyone else was glad to be rid of, you may understand something of what she felt standing on that sidewalk with the deed folded into her coat. Not triumph, something quieter, the specific weight of a thing that was now hers to answer. The neighbor woman, whose name was Clara Betts, met Nora at the door the following morning with an expression caught between relief and warning. She was perhaps 60, with the efficient manner of a person who had done difficult things without making a performance of them. She had, she explained, carried food to Aldous Finn for the last 2 years of his decline. She had found him near the end, sleeping on a cot he had pulled from the back room to avoid climbing the stairs. She had not, she said carefully, been permitted into the main room of the shop in all those years. He had conducted their brief exchanges in the doorway. He was protective of it, she said. Not in a frightened way, in a careful way. There is a difference. Nora asked what she remembered of the shop before it closed. Clara thought for a moment. Books, she said. A great many books, and a press in the back. He did some printing, same as your father, from what you've told me. He was not a warm man, but he was a precise one. He kept good records. She paused. He burned something. The year before he died, I smelled it from my window paper burning. A great deal of it. The key was iron, old pattern, and fit the lock with a resistance that suggested the mechanism had not been exercised in years. Well, Nora worked it carefully, the way her father had taught her to work a press screw that had seized, with patient pressure and no violence, until the pins yielded and the bolt drew back. The smell that met her was cold paper and mineral oil and the particular dryness of a room sealed against weather. For a long time, dust moved in the light from the open door. The shelves were still full. This was the first surprise. She had expected emptiness or disorder, the aftermath of a man who had retreated from his own life. Instead, the shelves were orderly. Books stood upright, spines out, arranged in a system she could not yet read. The floor had been swept at some point, though not recently. A counter ran along the left wall, and behind it, visible through a narrow doorway, she could see the corner of a press. The press was the thing she had come for, or so she told herself. A working press would have justified the $7 alone. She walked the length of the main room first, slowly, the way her father had walked a press room floor before touching anything, reading the space before imposing herself on it. The books were real books, not decorative. Many had been read. Some had paper slips tucked into their pages. The shelves themselves were well built, the joints mortised cleanly, the uprights secured to the walls with lag bolts at regular intervals. At the far end of the room, two sections of shelving met in a corner, floor to ceiling, packed tightly with what appeared to be ledger volumes and bound periodicals. The shelves there ran all the way to the back wall without a break. She stood before them and ran her finger along the spines. Agricultural journals, mining surveys, territorial government reports, issues of the Colorado Miner, dated from 1871 through 1879, with a gap of 3 years, and then a single issue from 1882. Nothing obviously remarkable. She went to the press. Her father had taught her on a Washington hand press, and this was a similar machine, a Columbian, heavy and elegant, with the imperial eagle cast into the counter-lever arm, its wings spread above the platen. It was old but not derelict. Someone had oiled it within the past few years. The typecases beside it were still populated, leads and slugs sorted into their compartments, a form still locked in the bed. She looked at the form for a long time. It was set type, ready to print, a page of text that had never been printed. She bent close and read it by the thin light from the doorway. It was a legal notice, or the form of one, the language of a land patent filing, with blanks where the parcel descriptions and the claimant's name would have been inserted. The compositing was careful and exact. Whoever had said it had known the work. She did not disturb it. She spent the rest of that first day taking inventory of the building, learning its dimensions and its defects, noting where the roof had allowed moisture in at the northeast corner, and where the floor joists showed the beginning of a soft spot near the front wall. She made notes in a small book she carried for this purpose. When she left in the late afternoon, she locked the door behind her, and she walked to the land office. The clerk there was a young man named Sutter, who appeared faintly startled to receive a visitor on what had apparently been a slow afternoon. She asked him for the property records on the building she had purchased, and he produced them after a search that took longer than it should have, given that the auction had been conducted 8 days prior. The record of ownership was straightforward enough. Aldous Fenn had purchased the building in 1864, the year the territory was organized, from a man named Harlan Cass who had built it. What interested Nora was the adjacent parcel. The lot to the north, where the assayer's office now stood, had been recorded in 1871 under the Garnet Crossing Mining and Land Improvement Company. The company itself was recorded as having been incorporated in Denver in 1870. Its principal officers were listed by name. She wrote them down. She also wrote down the name of the attorney who had filed the incorporation papers. He was a Denver man. His name appeared 3 more times in the records Sutter pulled for her, always in connection with land filings. In Garnet Crossing and the surrounding creek drainages, always in the early 1,870 seconds. She asked Sutter how long the county recorder's office kept original deed filings. He looked at her with some uncertainty. "Permanently," he said. "By statute, and if there were a discrepancy between a filed deed and a recorded plat?" "The deed controls," he said, after a pause that suggested he was deciding whether to answer. "The plat is derived from the survey. The deed is the instrument of title." She thanked him and left. The form in the press occupied her thoughts that night. Someone had set a legal notice and then not printed it. That was a deliberate act. A typesetter who had gone to the trouble of compositing a full form and locking it into the press had intended to print it. The fact that he had not meant something had stopped him. She went back the following morning with a lantern and better light, and she looked at the shelves more carefully. The ledger volumes in the corner were what drew her attention. She pulled the first one and found it was not a commercial ledger, but a record of land descriptions, parcel by parcel, with survey bearings written in a careful hand. The dates ran from 1869 through 1876. She pulled a second volume, which covered 1877 through 1882. A third was thinner, covering only 1883 and 1884, and then stopped. The descriptions in the ledgers were cross-referenced to column numbers, and when she looked at the columns, they corresponded to the dates of the Colorado minor issues on the shelf beside them. She pulled the 1872 issue and opened it, and found that the legal notices page had been carefully annotated in pencil in the margins, with numbers that matched the ledger columns. Aldous Finn had been collating. For more than a decade, he had been matching the legal notices published in the mining paper against his own hand-recorded survey of the parcels they described. The published notices were the ones that had been submitted for public record. His ledgers were what the land actually contained, and they did not match. She sat with the ledger open on the counter for a long time, comparing. The discrepancies were not dramatic. They were the kind of thing that would require a trained eye to see. The substitution of one survey bearing for another that moved a parcel boundary by 40 or 60 feet. The kind of adjustment that would mean little in open grassland, but a great deal on a creek drainage, where a vein of silver ore might sit on one side of a boundary or the other. The adjustments were always in the same direction. The parcels that belonged to the Garnet Crossing Mining and Land Improvement Company were always slightly larger in the public filings than in the ground truth Finn had recorded. Her father had taught her typesetting, but before that, before the Leadville camps, he had done journeyman work for a county surveyor in Ohio, and he had brought those habits home with him. He had taught her to read a survey bearing the way a printer reads type, as a precise notation that admitted no approximation. She knew what 43 feet meant on a slope above a creek. She could hear it in the numbers the way she could hear a letter set crooked in a form. The question was what Aldous Finn had known, and when, and why he had chosen to set a legal notice in type and then not print it. She found the answer 3 days later behind the shelves. She had been working from the conviction that the shelving in the corner was unusual. The lag bolts were at standard intervals on every other shelf section in the room, but the corner units were bolted differently, with an additional fastener at the base of each upright that served no structural purpose she could identify. When she looked closely at the floor in front of them, she could see a faint arc in the dust, the kind of mark a door makes when it swings. Her father had taught her to find things that had been hidden inside casework by working the joints rather than the surface. You did not pry. You felt for the give that indicated a hidden pivot, the slight variation in resistance that meant a piece was meant to move. She ran her fingers along the joint where the two corner units met, floor to ceiling, and found it on the third pass, a small wooden catch, spring-loaded, recessed into the shelf edge and painted over so many times it had nearly disappeared into the surface. She pressed it, and the entire corner unit swung outward on the additional bolts, which were not fasteners at all, but hinges, rotating in their channels smoothly and quietly, as if they had been maintained against exactly this moment. Behind the shelves was a space approximately 4 feet wide and 6 feet deep, running back to the exterior wall. It held a small writing desk, a stool, and, on a shelf above the desk, a wooden box with a hasp and a padlock. On the desk itself, in good order, were the originals. They were deed filings. Original documents, not copies. The paper heavy and official with territorial seals and notary stamps. 17 of them, covering the same creek, drainages, and parcel boundaries she had been tracking in the ledgers. And beside them in a tied bundle were 17 corresponding documents that had been filed with the county recorder's office, the versions that had entered the public record. She set one pair side by side and read them with the same attention she gave a proof pulled from a press. The parcel descriptions diverged. Not dramatically, not in a way that any ordinary reader would have noticed, but the survey bearings differed by the precise amounts she had recorded in her comparison of the ledger to the published notices. The originals showed smaller parcel dimensions. The filed versions showed the adjusted, expanded claims. Someone had substituted documents at the point of filing, replacing the originals with versions that reallocated acreage across the parcel boundaries in the direction of the company's holdings. The man who had originally held those originals had clearly given them to Finn for safekeeping. She found his name on the first document in the pile. He was a mining claim holder named Jacob Rowe. His family's name appeared on 7 of the 17 original deeds. She sat with this for a long time. The padlock box above the desk was a problem she solved with the smallest pick from her father's tool roll, a tool he had used for freeing type that had frozen in cold weather and that she had learned to use with some patience and a particular angle of torque. The lock was a simple ward mechanism. It opened in under 2 minutes. Inside the box was a single envelope, sealed with wax, addressed in Fenn's careful hand to the Territorial Land Commissioner's office in Denver. It had never been sent. Inside the envelope was a letter dated 1882, in which Fenn laid out what he had found with the precision of a man who had spent years organizing his evidence. He named the company. He named the attorney. He described the method of document substitution. He cited the specific parcels and the bearing discrepancies and the dates of filing. He noted that the original deeds were in his possession and offered to surrender them to any properly authorized commissioner. He had written it, and then he had sealed it, and then he had not sent it. Clara Betts, when Nora brought her to stand at the doorway of the hidden room, looked at it for a long time without speaking. He was afraid, she said finally. He had reason to be, Nora said. The attorney he named is still practicing in Denver. The company still holds those parcels. The adjusted boundaries are still on record. What will you do? Nora looked at the letter in her hand, the sealed envelope that a careful, precise man had written and kept and carried to his death without sending. She thought about the form locked in the press upstairs, the typeset and ready and never inked. Print it, she said. The letter, she understood, was not itself the proof. Fenn's letter, however thorough, was one man's account. What she had were the originals, the documents themselves, paired against the filed versions. 17 instances of a substitution that could be demonstrated side by side to any examiner who understood survey language. The documents proved it. She spent a week compositing. She pulled the old form from the press and distributed the type back into the cases. And then she began setting the notice she had planned from the beginning. Not a legal notice this time, but a documentary account, precise and spare. 3 pages of print that described the discrepancies in the file deeds, the language of a surveyor and the language of a typesetter. She set the bearing numbers exactly. She named the parcels by their recorded descriptions. She noted the dates of filing and the dates of the originals. She did not name the attorney or the company officers in the printed account because she understood that what she was printing was not an accusation, but a record, a thing that could be verified independently by anyone who looked at the paired documents. When the forms were locked and the press inked, she pulled a proof and read every line twice. Then she printed 30 copies on Fenn's paper, which was good stock, still supple after years in the sealed room. She sent the originals with a copy of the printed account and Fenn's unsent letter to the Territorial Land Commissioner by registered post. She sent a second set to the Attorney General's office in Denver. She delivered a third set by hand to Sutter at the county recorder's office, with a request that it be placed in the parcel file for each of the 17 affected claims. She kept the 17th copy herself. She also, because she was thorough, located Jacob Rowe's surviving family. The eldest son, a man named Thomas, ran a small freight operation out of a town 20 miles south. She wrote him a plain letter describing what she had found, naming the parcels, and enclosing a copy of the documentary account. She did not tell him what to do with it. She told him only that the originals were now in the hands of the Territorial Commissioner and that the filed versions were in question. His reply came 3 weeks later, and it was a single sentence, the handwriting of a man who had not written much and who had chosen his words with the same economy Fenn had chosen his. My father told us before he died that the land had been taken from us by paper and that paper would have to give it back. The process that followed was slow and without drama. The Territorial Commissioner sent an examiner, a methodical man from Denver named Ayers, who spent 4 days in Garnet Crossing comparing documents and taking measurements. He found what Nora had found. He found additional discrepancies. She had not noticed 2 parcels she had not yet cross-referenced in the ledger. He wrote his report in the dry language of administrative correction, citing the original deeds as controlling instruments and recommending that the recorded plats be amended to reflect the original survey bearings. The attorney in Denver did not contest the findings. His name appeared once more in the county records the following spring, in a deed of correction that transferred the disputed acreage back to the original claimants. He did not write to Nora or appear in Garnet Crossing. The Garnet Crossing Mining and Land Improvement Company, which had been largely inactive for several years, dissolved its Colorado charter before the correction deeds were fully processed. The Rowe family's recovered parcels included the creek drainage that a later assay would confirm held a modest but workable vein of silver. Thomas Rowe came to Garnet Crossing in the spring to begin that work. He stopped at the bookstore, which now had a compositor's sign in the window alongside the older shelf of books, and he stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the press and then at Nora. "I would like to pay for the printing," he said, "whatever it cost." She told him what it had cost in paper and ink, which was almost nothing. She did not tell him what it had cost in the other currency, the weeks of careful work, the mornings sitting with ledgers and survey descriptions, the particular loneliness of doing a careful thing alone in a sealed room that smelled of old paper and a dead man's patience. He paid what she asked. He did not try to pay more. Garnet Crossing was not a town that changed its opinion of a person loudly. The 2 merchants who had laughed at the auction did not apologize. But the traffic into the print shop in the months that followed was different from what she had expected in a town that size, and she understood that opinions were being revised without announcement in the quiet way that communities absorb the evidence that they were wrong about someone. Clara Betts came in most weeks on no particular errand, or so she claimed. She would stand at the counter and look at the press and then at the shelves of books, and once she said without preamble that she thought Aldous Fenn would have approved of how things had gone. Nora thought about the locked form set and ready and never printed. She thought about the sealed envelope, addressed and stamped and never sent. She thought about the years a careful man had spent in the room behind the shelves, maintaining his records, oiling the press, waiting for something she did not think he had been sure would ever come. He did the hard part, she said. The hidden door remained functional. Nora left it as Fenn had built it, hinged to swing, the catch still operable. She used the room behind it for paper storage. The desk she kept, and the stool, and above the desk, on the shelf where the locked box had sat, she placed the small leather case of her father's tools, the compositor stick, and the pick, and the tight gauge, and the spacing rule. They were not decorative, she used them. The form she had set for the documentary account she did not distribute back into the cases when the printing was finished. She left it locked in the press bed. Some months later, when she needed the press for a different job, she pulled the form and examined it one last time, and then distributed the type with the same care she gave every tool. It went back into its compartments, leads in their box, slugs sorted by size. The type that had once named a wrong and proved it returned to the general case, ready for the next use, which was how type worked, which was what her father had always said. Nothing is used only once. You clean it and replace it and let it mean something else. The press itself, she kept running. In time, she hired a girl of 14 to learn the trade. The girl was quick with her hands and quick with the work, and Nora taught her the way her father had taught her, which was not by instruction alone, but by placing the tools in her hands and letting the materials speak. What Garnet Crossing made of any of this was what small towns make of most things: a story that grew in the telling, with details added or dropped depending on who was doing the telling. In most versions, Nora was somewhat younger or somewhat older than she had actually been. In some versions, the hidden room was larger and more elaborate than it was. In the version told by Clara Betts, which Nora believed to be the most accurate, Aldous Fenn was given his proper measure, described not as a recluse or a miser, but as a man who had done what he could with what he had, and who had trusted, in the way of careful people who cannot see the future, that what he preserved would find the right hands. It had. That autumn, the creek below the Row claim ran clear over granite, and the aspens above had turned in the cold air to a yellow that had no name precise enough to hold it. Nora walked that ground once to see what had been in question, to understand the ground as Fenn had understood it through the survey bearings in his ledger. It was not dramatic. It was a slope of mixed timber and rock above a drainage that collected snowmelt and held it through the summer, and it was ordinary and particular and worth what it was worth, because it was exactly that size and no other, and its boundaries were now correctly recorded in the ledger of the county recorder's office, in a hand that was not Fenn's and not the attorney's but the examiner's, who had verified what the original deeds said and entered it cleanly into the permanent record. She walked back to town in the late afternoon, the red of her shawl bright against the bleached grass, and opened the shop and set the compositing lamp and went to work. Some things are guarded because they are feared. Some are guarded because they are precious. The difference is not always visible from outside. Aldous Fenn had known the difference. He had spent 11 years making sure the thing he guarded would survive him, keeping it in order, keeping the press oiled, keeping the ledgers current, until his hands would not cooperate anymore, and then lying down in the back room. He had not known her name. He had not known when she would come, or that she would come at all. He had only known what he had and what it required, and that some things have to be preserved beyond the life of the person who first understood their value. The lamp burned through the evening in the window of the print shop, and the type clicked in its cases, and the press stood ready. And in the room behind the shelves, the paper was clean and stacked and waiting. She had not slept well in those first weeks in Garnet Crossing. The room above the print shop, which she rented from a widow named Halverson, who kept chickens in rows at 4 in the morning, was adequate and cold, and she would lie in the dark and hear the altitude wind work at the window frame and think about the building 2 streets over, locked and waiting. She had purchased it without having looked inside. That was the nature of the thing. You committed to the cost before you knew the return, and the commitment was itself a kind of statement about what you believed was possible. Her father had done this repeatedly, though not with real estate. He had taken apprentices who cost more than they produced for a year before they became useful. He had purchased presses at auction that needed more work than he had anticipated. He had bought a lot in a town that flooded the following spring and lost most of his investment. He had not spoken of any of these things as mistakes. He had spoken of them as the education that could not be purchased any cheaper, and he had continued. The continuation was the point, he said. The continuation was where the knowledge lived. She thought about this in the mornings when she walked from the Halverson house to the bookstore, in the cold before the town fully woke, with the frost still on the boardwalk planks and the mountains above the valley picking up the first light, while the street was still gray. She thought about what it meant to continue through ignorance of outcome, to set type for a page that had not yet been written. The ledger work took longer than she had anticipated, not because the records were difficult, but because she was careful. She cross-referenced each entry twice. She made her own notes in a separate book, using the same column system Finn had developed, checking her reading of the survey bearings against the standard formulas she had learned from her father's survey work in Ohio. When she found a discrepancy, she verified it 3 times before she entered it as confirmed, because she understood that precision was not a virtue in this work, but a requirement. An error on her part would invalidate the rest. She could not afford errors. There were long afternoons when the light through the dirty windows was gray and flat, and she sat at the counter with the ledger open and the published notices beside it, and worked through the numbers column by column. It was the kind of work that looks from outside like patience, but that feels from inside like a conversation with material that will eventually answer if you listen correctly. Her father had described this as the feel of type in a stick, the moment when the letters began to behave as if they wanted to be set rather than resisting your hand. She did not know a better description. Clara Betts brought her soup twice during those weeks. She brought it without fanfare, set it on the counter, and asked no questions about the papers spread around it. She understood apparently that the work was serious, and that serious work required fuel and no conversation. Nora ate the soup and thanked her, and the next morning returned to the ledgers. What she found there accumulated slowly, entry by entry, cross-reference by cross-reference, until it was undeniable, not as an accusation, but as a fact of arithmetic. The parcels were wrong. The numbers did not match the ground, and the direction of the mismatch was not random, but consistent, always moving acreage toward the company and away from the original holders, the way a river moves sediment toward the sea, patient and invisible, and governed by the shape of the land. She thought about Jacob Rowe, whose name she had only read on a deed. She thought about what it meant to lose a piece of ground to arithmetic, to have a claim that was correct and true, and then to find it gone, shrunk, revised into something smaller by figures she could not read. Her father had taught her to read those figures. Most people could not. That was the method she understood. The method depended on most people not being able to read it. She thought about that for a long time before she touched the hidden catch. The days after she found the room were different in texture from the days before it. She had been investigating a suspicion. After she had the documents themselves, and the investigation became something more like stewardship. The originals needed to be kept safe and kept in order, and delivered to the right authority without damage. She made an inventory of each document, recording its parcel number and date, and the names of the parties in her own notebook so that she held a complete record separate from the documents themselves. If the documents were lost or damaged in transit, her record would at least establish what had existed. She also made careful copies of each paired deed, writing out the survey bearings in her own hand, noting the discrepancies in a separate column. This was slower work than printing because it required absolute accuracy, and she could not use a proofreading pass the way she could with set type. She read each copy against the original twice, character by character, bearing by bearing, the way she would read a corrected proof against the galley. When she was satisfied, she bound the copies in order with the originals and wrapped the bundle in clean paper. Sutter at the land office had looked at her differently after her first visit, not with hostility, but with the careful attention of a person who has been asked a question more serious than they expected. When she returned with the paired documents, he looked at them for a long time without speaking. And then he looked at her, and she understood from his expression that he was deciding whether to be helpful or cautious. He decided to be helpful, which was to his credit. He pulled the county records himself and laid them beside what she had brought. He did not say anything for a long time. He was a young man, but he was precise, and precision was a language she recognized. "This would need the commissioner," he said finally. "I know," she said. "I am sending it to the commissioner. I wanted the county record noted first, so there is a local record. That the documents were presented here," he nodded slowly. "I can note that in the file. Please." He did. He wrote the notation himself, in a steady hand, recording the date and the nature of the documents presented, and his own observation that they appeared to differ from the filed versions on record. He signed it. He did not make her ask him to sign it. She thanked him as she left. The printing itself was a pleasure, after weeks of careful examination. To take the accumulated evidence and compress it into the disciplined economy of set type, to find the exact language that would say what the document showed without saying more than the document showed, was work she had been trained for without knowing it. Her father had taught her that type was not decoration, but argument. Every piece of type was a claim about the world. A page of print was a statement that something had occurred, or that something was true, or that something should be read and understood. The printer's job was to make that statement as clear as the evidence permitted and no clearer. She set the notice in 12-point type, which was legible and economical, and she used a plain Roman face from Fenn's cases that had worn to a good authoritative presence without being heavy. She chose her words the way she chose leading, for the space they created, for what they let the reader's eye do. She stated facts. She cited the documents. She described the discrepancies in the language of a person who understood survey bearings and knew that her reader would need to understand them too. Where the language required a term that an ordinary reader might not know, she defined it in plain English in the following sentence, without apology and without condescension. She pulled the proof and read it against her notes. She corrected 3 letters that had shifted slightly in the locking, and 1 line of figures where she had transposed 2 digits. She pulled a second proof and read it again. Then she printed. 30 copies had felt right. enough to reach the people who needed to receive it, few enough that she knew exactly where each one went. She kept a record of the distribution in the same notebook she had used for the ledger work, noting the date of mailing, the recipient, and the method of delivery for each copy. When the last copy was filed in her own records, she closed the notebook and set it on the shelf above her father's tools, beside the box that had held the commissioner's letter. The weight of it, laid down, was different from the weight of it carried. She had not understood this until she could feel the difference. The girl she hired, whose name was Delia, came to her in March of the following year, through Clara Betts, who had mentioned to a woman at church that there was work at the print shop for someone willing to learn. Delia was 14 and had a quiet, observant quality that Nora recognized as the beginning of a good printer's instinct. She watched before she touched. She asked questions only when she had exhausted her own observation, which meant that when she asked, the question was a real one. Nora taught her to set type the way her father had taught her, beginning with the job-stick and the cases, building the physical memory in the hands before she explained the system behind it. Type is not read in a case, her father had told her. It is felt. You learn where the compartments are, the way you learn where objects are in a darkened room by moving through them until your hands know the distances. After that, the reading is in your eyes and the setting is in your hands, and the two can run in parallel, which was where the speed came from. Delia had the hands for it, which was not a thing that could be taught. The feel for the right pressure, the awareness of when a letter was seated properly and when it was not, the sensitivity to the small variations in type body that announced a damaged piece before it printed badly. Some people never acquired it. Delia had it in the first week, rough and untrained, but the substrate was there. By summer, she was competent with the common sizes and faces, and she was learning to lock forms, which required a different and more systematic kind of attention. Nora showed her the sequence of coins and the use of the shooting stick and the way to test a locked form by pressing the flat of the hand against the face and feeling for any give that announced a loose type or slug. Delia followed the sequence precisely, but more importantly, she began to develop the intuition for what a tight form felt like, the authority of metal properly confined, the slight solidity that distinguished a locked form from one that was merely held. Nora thought sometimes about what Aldous Fenn had made of this space over the decades he kept it. He had purchased the building when he was a younger man, in the first year of the territory, with the kind of confidence that early territories produced in people who came to them with a plan. He had built the hidden room himself, or had it built before any of the events that would make it necessary. That was foresight of a particular kind, the instinct that something would need to be kept even before you knew what it was. Her father had that quality too. He kept more tools than he needed at any given time, not from acquisitiveness, but from the understanding that needs shifted, that the job you were working today was not the job you would be working in 3 years, and that the tool you did not have was the one that cost you the most. He had taught her to maintain tools she did not currently need with the same care. She gave the ones in daily use because neglect was hard to reverse and readiness was worth its upkeep. The compositor's stick and the pick and the type gauge, cleaned and oiled and placed on the shelf in the hidden room, were her response to that teaching. She was not keeping them for herself. She was keeping them for whoever came next, in the way Fenn had kept his press oiled and his ledgers current and his locked form set and waiting. The continuation was the point. The continuation was where the knowledge lived. The hidden door she oiled twice a year, in spring and fall, applying a thin coat of machine oil to the hinge pins and working them through their full rotation several times to keep the mechanism free. It swung as quietly in November as it had on the morning she first opened it. This seemed important to maintain, though she could not have given a precise reason.